Hi, everybody. My name is Clayton Flesher. I'm one of the co-organizers of DevOps OKC. I want to welcome those of you who are here. Hopefully we'll have some more folks coming in as well. Just real quick, some thank yous and some bookkeeping before we get started. This is a Techlahoma meetup. Techlahoma is a nonprofit volunteer-run organization that helps sponsor these groups. They'll be covering the cost of the food and drinks today, so there's an opportunity for you to give back to them. They have a recurring donation option, so you can set up auto payments each month with them. I do it, and I encourage you to do the same. We do have a code of conduct, so if you would like to see that, you can check the techlahoma.org, I believe, /code of conduct. They recently created a help wanted board, so if you're interested in helping out with it could be code or non-code related. So for example, the slides that you guys were seeing before the meetup, that was an example of they put a help wanted up of somebody to create an app that did auto generation of the slides for them of new meetups and things. And then this will be recorded on Twitch, so you can watch it later if you want and pass the link on to others. The event space at Starspace 46, they donate the event space, so thank them for doing that. And if you're interested, Starspace is a great place to come work. They have multiple levels of memberships available. You can everything from having offices down to working out in the open area co-working space with like covers you what, not dedicated for you desks, and multiple levels between. There's also 36 Degrees North in Tulsa, so if you're interested in checking them out, please do so. But let's see, I'm gonna get my slides going here. So yeah, a little bit about me. I'm actually your speaker today as well. We're going to be talking about Jenkins pipeline strategies. My name is Clayton Flesher. I work at Hague Software. We office here out of Starspace 46. We focus on API integrations and DevOps. And this is actually where those two areas tend to meet for me when I'm doing consulting. A lot of times I'm working with clients who have just picked up a new product that I'm going to be working with, and they haven't yet figured out how they're going to do their deployments with that product yet, and so they want me to develop a deployment and testing pipeline for them as part of our development cycles. So I have a lot of experience with Jenkins. It is my go-to pipeline tool, though it is not by any means the only one out there. There are quite a few. But it's what I'm most comfortable in, and I'm going to talk about some of the strategies I like to use in Jenkins, and some of these will carry over to other pipeline tools as well. So who this talk isn't for. So if you guys are already using Jenkins and it's working for you, do not necessarily, what comes out of our conversations today, do not necessarily go rewrite a bunch of working pipelines because you went and saw a talk and you have new ideas. Also, if you aren't using Jenkins and what you have is working for you, don't throw your working pipeline away to go get Jenkins, please. Basically, if it's working, don't break it first. But that being said, if you are considering a pipeline tool, or if you are using Jenkins, but you have some new projects coming up where you're going to need to develop pipelines for them, I would definitely take some of the things we talk about today to heart and try to get some of those ideas into those pipelines going forward. So I'm going to talk about a few things that are Jenkins specific that are not necessarily about the pipeline that you're going to be building. They're more about decisions you need to make when you're getting and managing Jenkins, and one of those is going to be your installation OS. So Jenkins is a Java application, so you're like, who cares what OS it's on? It's Java. It matters for how you're going to be maintaining Jenkins over time. So how that works is you'll have what's called a master, your Jenkins master, and it will be and it'll have multiple workers or one or more workers. And that master will be installed on usually Linux or Windows. If you install it on Windows, you can install it as a service, and that gives you one advantage of letting you manage updates for Jenkins versions through the UI. That's not an option on Linux. So you have to set up some other system for doing that yourself. Historically, Jenkins has been installed or done on Linux with a WAR file, and so you just download a new WAR file, turn off Jenkins, replace the existing WAR file, and fire it back up. And you can do that with like a chef cookbook or whatever. There's also the option of running Jenkins on Docker with a volume. I actually like doing that because to get new updates, it's literally Docker pull, Docker stop, Docker run, and you're updated. So yeah, that's something to consider as the installation OS. How you manage your updates will be, and you do want to manage updates. I don't know how many of you are using Jenkins currently. How many of you are running on a current version of Jenkins? One, and the rest of you are, yeah, because I walk into clients all the time that have Jenkins versions that haven't been updated for years. It's really common. So something to consider there. Also, if you're only going to have one worker, your installation OS matters because it'll determine whether or not you need to get more workers. So if you're running on Windows and you only use the master node, you can only do jobs realistically on Windows. There's a Docker option, but it's pretty hinky on Windows still. So if you're using Linux, the Docker workers become a lot more easy to spin up and spin down, and also, but you have the trade-off. There's another consideration, how you handle your UI. So this may not seem like a thing to really worry about at first, but it can actually matter on how well your pipeline gets integrated with your team. If you're using Blue Ocean, it's a really nice UI, and it's pretty clean. It's the new-ish UI for Jenkins. It's been around for a few years now. But I recommend teams putting up a monitor in their office that points to the Blue Ocean builds, and that way they have a nice clean. When they push code, they can see the builds happening. They don't have to go log into the Jenkins server to see it. It's just really nice, and Blue Ocean makes that experience a lot better than just having this ugly. The classic Jenkins is pretty ugly, so Blue Ocean is nice. I recommend using it, and I recommend putting it up as a monitor in your team's office if that's an option for your team, if you're working on together. So now we're actually going to get into the pipelines themselves. So does anyone disagree with me about storing your pipelines in source control? How many of you are not storing your pipelines in source control currently? Do you know what I mean by this? Anyone? Okay, so for a lot of your CI servers, Bamboo, stuff like that, you can go into the CI system and set up pipelines yourself, or you can have them pull the actual build jobs in from either the source control of the application they're building from or from some external library. The only problem with that is you pull in the new update of Jenkins and it screws up your site and you lose all your work and you have to go rebuild Jenkins. If you don't have if you're not storing your actual build pipelines in source control, you lose a lot of work. So store your pipelines in source control. If you use Jenkins, you're going to run into this. Plugin dependency hell. As soon as you install Jenkins, the first thing it asks you is, do you want the recommended plugins? And then it installs about 20, 25 plugins for you. And all of those plugins have a bunch of plugins of their own. And if you ever go look at your plugin updates list, you are constantly, almost every day, having new versions of plugins come out. You're going to very quickly run into plugin dependency hell. My suggestion is stay with the general recommended plugins plus a few key ones that that are maintained by the Jenkins team or by CloudBees, for example. CloudBees is a company that has built their entire, they're a company that heavily contributes to Jenkins, and they've built a lot of Jenkins plugins and tools, so they're pretty safe to use their stuff. But if you're starting to use like random third-party Docker plugin that hasn't been updated in 6 months, like you're very likely going to run into problems pretty quickly with as far as things conflicting and it screwing with your UI and things. Okay. For those of you who are using Jenkins, are you using scripted or declarative pipelines? Declarative. Okay. Is there anyone who's using scripted pipelines? Okay. What's your rationale for choosing scripted? Do you have a preference for those? Okay. Okay, yeah, so complex pipelines can lead to needing to use scripted. So what this means is, so Jenkins pipelines are written in Groovy. There's a syntax they brought out a few years ago called the declarative pipeline syntax. If you actually go look at Jenkins syntax, this is the first one in the documentation that they teach you about. And the reason is because it's what they plan on using going forward, as far as like, this is what we recommend people use. You can still use scripted pipelines, and they are letting you like define Groovy functions and do actions inside of Groovy functions. The advantage, I think, of the declarative is you can call scripts. You can call the scripted pipeline stuff within a declarative pipeline. So if you actually need that extra level of complexity, you can do it in a declarative pipeline by just referencing scripts when you need them. But I'm a fan of declarative pipelines. I think they're much more readable. So I suggest using them, and it's what the Jenkins people generally are moving toward. This one's interesting, Jenkins files versus global shared libraries. So the way this works is we're storing our pipelines in our source control. But where are we storing them in our source control? Are we putting them with the application themselves? So in what's called a Jenkins file, or are we putting them in their own code repository and referencing them from that Jenkins file? There's advantages and disadvantages to doing both of these. I saw you nodding when, Jeff, when you said, are you using the Jenkins file with the application? What advantage do you see over doing it that way? Yep.
So as the structure of your application or the needs of your application change, you're checking it in, but old builds still work for previous tags that maybe you're having to maintain for whatever reason, because it's version right alongside the actual code that's being built.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of repeat what he said for the Twitch folks. Basically, by storing the pipeline build code, the code that's needed to build the pipeline and run it, with the application code in a Jenkins file in the project root, you're versioning the actual pipeline for the project alongside the code base. And I actually like that as well as a developer, because if it's a complex build, I can go in and kind of like, and I'm trying to get started on the project, like because I'm a consultant, I'm constantly getting started on new projects. And if there's anything weird about how they're doing it, it'll show up in that Jenkins file. So I can go in there and kind of figure out what's going on. Now, that being said, it can get very painful if you're doing something like a microservice architecture and you're using a Jenkins file for every one of your projects. Because generally with a microservice architecture, all of your project builds and deployments use exactly the same steps. If they don't, you don't be using a microservice architecture. You want a bunch of very small applications that are all very similar to one another, but just do different things under the hood. They have the same kinds of ways to build them. And if you're doing that, I actually recommend using a global shared library. And the reason is, let's say I decide that we need to change who has, what the Active Directory team that has the permissions to deploy to production is called, or something like that. Well, if I have 25 code bases that I have to go make that change in, or I can go change it in one code base and it'll automatically get picked up by every one of those projects, I like doing that. Now, historically, if you're using global libraries, those don't let you use declarative syntax until September of last year. So now you can, and I have done it on a couple of projects now and really like it. Because most of the projects I'm working on, we are using a microservice architecture, just because of the particular, I'm doing API integrations, so it's a bunch of little APIs that are all talking to one another. So I like using global shared libraries. The actual Jenkins file that lives in the project just references the shared library name. So it's 2 lines of code, the Jenkins file is. And then the actual library that they're using to build the project lives in its own repository. And you just tell the Jenkins that things that are called this live at this code base. And you can tell it whether to build master when you make, or to use master when you make changes or whatever. You can handle all that your own. So nodes. What kind of nodes are we going to use? How are we going to, so are we using Docker for building our projects? Are we using EC2 instances? How are we spinning them up and spinning them down? Your actual pipeline, if you're using declarative pipelines, is going to care about this. It needs to reference like whether you're using Docker nodes, what the base image is. You can actually tell it to use a Docker file that lives in the application project for the builds if you want. But that's a thing to care about. I actually, by default in a Jenkins pipeline, you can tell it everything's going to be in this kind of node. And so whenever you go into a stage, so like whenever we go into the build stage or we go into the unit testing stage, it's always going to be this node. I never do that. I always set the agent to be none. The reason why we'll talk about a little bit later with inputs, but that makes it so that each one of my steps is more granularly decides what kind of agent I'm using. So for my testing and deployment to, let's say I'm building a Java-based application and it's using something like JUnit and Maven. I can build the application and run the tests with one Docker image. And then I can use another Docker image to push that code out to, that has like a command line tool that I need for pushing that code out to my hosted environment. And so you get more granularity control by doing it that way. All right. So you're going to learn from my pain. Managing build server dependencies. This is actually the dependencies you need for building your project. So are we using Node to build the project? Are we using Java? Is this a Ruby application? And what are we actually using to build it? If it's Ruby, are we using Bundler? Are we using Maven if we're Java people? I was recently on a project where they had a bunch of workers. All the workers were EC2 instances. They were long-living EC2 instances, and they were set up to automatically update the version of Java over time. And then we came in one Monday, and every one of the build jobs in the entire on the entire Jenkins server that was a Java-based Mavenized application stopped working. They all broke, everything. And it took them days to figure out why. They thought maybe, well, the reason it took them days is because they were also in the process of migrating from Nexus artifact repository to Artifactory. So they just assumed that was the cause because it's the thing they were touching. So they spent days trying to figure out, everyone was setting up to use the Artifactory on their local machine and it wasn't working. And finally what they figured out was they had these EC2 instances set up to automatically update Java, and for some reason, something went wrong. And all the EC2 instances updated Java to something that would no longer run the builds. And so they were letting the EC2 instances manage their build server dependencies. There are ways to avoid having those kinds of problems. Some of them are something like Packer, where you build your own DigitalOcean droplet, your own EC2 instance image. You can build your own Azure image, all that kind of stuff, and then you use those for running your builds. And that gives you more control over exactly what version of whatever kind of thing you're trying to use. You can also use Docker if you're building from a base image that's tied to a particular version of something. The third option is to let Jenkins manage its own dependency tools, and these are through what are called global tools. So what you do is you say, I have an EC2 instance. When I fire up a new worker, the first time a worker runs a job that needs a JDK, like the job specifically says, I need this JDK tool and I need this Maven tool, It goes out and downloads exactly the version you tell it to go download from Apache or whatever. I like using global tools because what tools are being used in the build pipeline are documented in the pipeline at the top under the global tools section, and I don't have to worry about things like my EC2 instance updating and it screwing me over. Because I know exactly what version of Java and what version of Maven exactly. They're all using exactly the same one. So, yeah. So triggering our jobs. Who here, why would you pick one of these over the other? Because this is actually a consideration. You have to make this decision if you're dealing with enterprise companies. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So webhooks, Jenkins supports webhooks with GitHub, GitLab, all that stuff. But it assumes that, I mean, that's assuming your GitHub can talk to your Jenkins server. If your Jenkins server is behind a VPN and, you know, has very specific rules about what can and can't get in and out and all that, Policy SCM is probably your best option. So what Policy SCM is you set up a cron statement, like every X number of minutes, go check the code base to see if there's been updates. Now, Policy SCM, I end up having to use it a lot because I deal with large enterprise companies that have like weird rules around security, and I didn't get to pick where the Jenkins server got installed and all that stuff, and I don't get to open up firewalls. So we use it a lot, but a lot of companies are like, we'll set the Policy SCM to once every 30 minutes or once every 15 minutes. Well, guys, it's not an automated build pipeline if your developers have to go log into your Jenkins server and click the go button because they don't want to wait 25 minutes for the job to kick off. So if you can use webhooks, use them. If you use Policy SCM, make your pull time short. Like, yeah, you're going to get a little more traffic, but like, it's worth the not going more than 5 minutes. I suggest doing Policy SCM every 5 minutes. So if anyone disagrees with me about that, like, I would like to hear it. There might be reasons why I might be wrong, but yeah, don't set a 30-minute pull time on your jobs. Build once. And there's an asterisk next to this because this is actually a lie. I don't actually build once. But this is something I picked up from the Java world. When I was a Ruby guy, I didn't care. It was my code. Like, it's building from the code. Like, the code is the artifact. But in the Java world, they were like, we don't want you to build and then deploy this build to the dev environment and then build on a whole different worker in a whole different environment and deploy that to QA and then build again and deploy that to production. And then what gets deployed into my Artifactory or my Nexus is a completely different one from all of those. Because there's no guarantee that it's going to actually work if it's not using, like, what if it's a different worker that did the build and there was something weird about that worker for some reason? So the trick is, and what they suggest doing, and I think this is a good idea for all languages, is build once and then use that same code base for when you deploy to each one of your environments and to your artifact repository. So you guys are like, well, I don't use artifact repositories in Ruby. Well, you can zip up your version, you can zip that thing up and put it out there in an S3 bucket or put it out there in Nexus. Like, Nexus will accept your zip files. Stick that stuff somewhere so that you have particular builds of your application tightly versioned, and it's not versioned in like the gem file is not the best way to version your applications. So build once, and then use something called stash and unstash between stages. You can stash everything that's in this directory and use it, or in the next, at the end of this step, like let's say I build my application and I stash everything that's in the build directory. And then the next step, I can say everything under that directory, unstash it and use it for running my tests, and then stash it again, and then go unstash it and use that for for deploying to wherever, and you're using exactly the same files for your steps. With Maven, this works really well. I say Maven a lot because it's my preferred build tool, but yeah, stash and unstash. The asterisk next to build once. So if you're like me and you're building jar files, And part of your life cycle for building your projects is that you run the tests as part of the life cycle. Like in Maven, by default, when you tell it to build, it runs your tests. I like to build twice before and the second one is the one I put to my artifact repository. The first one I build without running my tests, because if I know that blows up, the place to go look for it's probably not in my tests. So I have a less number of variables of things that could go wrong in that very first step. So I build the project without the tests, build the project with the tests, use that for everything else. So we should version our releases. Jenkins will help you do this. Please version your releases. Yeah. Secrets management. How are you guys managing secrets in your build pipelines right now? Does anyone want to put themselves out on a limb on that one? Jeff, I know you're using Jenkins. How are you managing secrets?
Depends on the secret, but sometimes the Jenkins credential manager will provide the set on the actual agents.
Okay.
Depending on what the secret is and the source code.
So Jeff said that he does it depending on the kind of secret it is. Like you may have the secrets in the environment of the worker as an environment variable, and that he uses the credentials manager in Jenkins. So Jenkins comes in out of the box. It has a pretty decent credentials manager. So so out of the box, it has a pretty decent credentials manager that will encrypt values for you. So if you go in and give it a username and password value, it'll encrypt the password value for you. You can encrypt texts, just a text string, or you can do password username pairs. If you set those as an environment variable in a Jenkins job, you set the environment variable to be like, my credentials for X equals this value, and then it just appends an underscore USR and an underscore PWD environment variable for you, so you can access the username and password that way as environment variables inside the job. If you're using something like HashiCorp Vault or something like that, there's plugins for integrating with that. So if you guys have like something that has an API that Jenkins can talk to for doing your secrets management, there's a pretty good chance you can use that plugin. And that will be a well-done plugin. It's not going to be somebody's off-the-shelf. HashiCorp would have been directly involved in getting that one written. So I definitely suggest using credentials in your, encrypting your credentials in your projects. If you, for example, need to, so one of the things I like to do in a lot of my projects, we have properties files, and we'll actually encrypt the values in the properties files, and then I just use a single key per environment for decrypting the values that are in the dev properties or decrypting the values that are in the QA properties. So that's a nice option that's available for those of you who have stuff built into your tooling that lets you encrypt and decrypt properties values. Input steps. Do any of you, so this is one where if you've just used something like Travis before, you probably haven't run into these. This is something that the more robust CI pipeline systems make available to you. And it's the ability to go in and click, yes, go on to QA, or yes, go ahead and deploy it to production. Opinions on whether or not you should use these. Does anybody think you should or shouldn't in particular? I know if Ryan Haig were here, he would be like saying we shouldn't use input steps and they're terrible because everything should be fully automated all the way through to production. But that's not plausible for most clients. Most clients are like, hey, I don't want the person who I don't want somebody to be able to commit code and it just magically show up in production 30 minutes later, just because some tests passed. Maybe they turned off the tests. So input steps are a way for you to say in Jenkins, if you're a member of this particular group, let's say you've integrated your Jenkins to log in with Active Directory, for example. You can say members of this Active Directory group are allowed to click the Go to QA button. And members of this Active Directory group are allowed to click the Go to Production button. There's some things to know about this, if you need to set the agent to none in Jenkins when you're using this step, because if you don't, you're going to tie up a worker the whole time that input step's sitting and waiting. So that's why I always set the default agent to none at the top, because these input steps then don't tie up a Docker worker somewhere or something, and they can just sit there and wait forever. And you can also tell it to, once you've clicked the go to QA step on a particular job, all the jobs that came before it that were still on that go to QA step automatically stop. And if you say, if you have a whole bunch of them that are waiting to go to production because you've gotten them all through QA, and everyone on this waiting in the production step, once you click tell one particular job to go to production, it automatically stops all the jobs below it. So that's a useful feature to have. I like input steps. They're not continuous delivery technically, because you're not automating all the way through without having humans have to go in and click buttons. But for most people, getting the alternative is crazy, in my opinion, crazy rules around what we have to name our source control branches and stuff like that. Like this branch is in this environment and this branch is in this environment. You can drastically simplify that by just saying, only pull this branch, master, and have input steps that only these people in this Active Directory group are allowed to go through and click on. It drastically simplifies your pipelines. And then please have build notifications. If you have, send a Slack message to not a dedicated Slack channel. Don't have a Slack channel that is just for builds, because nobody's ever going to check that Slack channel. Stick it in the Slack channel that everyone likes to put cat photos in. Emails are okay too, but build notifications are really useful. I like to have them in two situations. I always have them set up to always send me a build notification when a job fails, and send me a build notification when it gets all the way through the pipeline. If it gets all the way through the pipeline in the way I like to write pipelines, it's gone through all the input steps, and all the way through the pipeline is successfully deployed to production. So you get notifications in two situations: when something goes to production and when something blows up. So everyone knows to pay attention to those notifications, because something bad just happened, or something went to production, and I need to make sure it was supposed to. So that's it for me. I'm happy to take questions at this time, because I still have a few minutes left. So if not, we can all go eat more chicken and toast. So yeah, questions, anybody? I'm happy to show some examples. I can't before. Let me see if I. I'd actually love to see that. Yeah. Yeah, here, let me. So this is not a working, I didn't actually go make sure this pipeline actually does what it's supposed to do, but it's very similar to how a pipeline would look for me. So I look here, it's declarative, so it starts with the pipeline syntax. Top level agent is none. It sets some environment variables. You can set environment variables both for each individual stage, or if you do it at this top level, it automatically creates those environment variables from every stage. And you can see here they're pulling in the credentials by the credentials name. And then, so here would be my build without test step. And it just runs the Maven clean build. If that step passes, then it'll move on to the next one automatically, if that stage goes through. And this is the build with tests. And then if that stage passes, then I go ahead and deploy an artifact to something like Artifactory. And then once I've gone through that, then I unstash that and go to deploying to my development environment. So you can see here I'm using different Docker images for the kinds of things I'm doing. In the first ones, I was using the Maven Docker image. And I would normally pass it something like a Maven settings file, depending on how you have your, because to tell it where to go to get your settings and things. I didn't get that complicated with it this time. But you would tell it in the first Docker images for the builds, use my Ruby bundler Docker image or use my Maven Docker image for the actual building. And then in the deployment steps, the only thing I need is the CLI. Yeah, you had a question, Jeff.
How long do stashes hang around for? Are they automatically cleaned up after some amount of time? Or?
So I don't remember off the top of my head, but there is a way to, so how does that work? I don't think they're cleaned up until so there's a step at the end that says clean everything up. If it fails, or if it gets all the way through to production. So the question, yeah, thank you, Aaron. The question was, how long do stashes hang around? Do you know the answer to your own question, or do you? Yeah, I think they stick around indefinitely unless you tell them to get cleaned up. So there's a cleanup step at the end, but that may have changed. The default for that may have changed in Jenkins. I'd have to check. So here's my input, my first input. I said, well, we don't want it to always just go to QA after it deploys to development. So we have here, it just brings up a question. And if you're in Blue Ocean, the Blue Ocean UI, when your job gets to that step, it'll just pop up a nice box with a deploy to QA and a yes, no, or okay, no. And anyone who's logged in with the right permissions can click the button. Anyone else who tries to click the button, it just doesn't do anything. It just ignores them. So, I have here that the submitter that has the permission to do that is my Active Directory QA submitter group. Like, you can create a group in Active Directory. If you're not integrated with something like Active Directory, then you can do something like you can create groups within Jenkins itself and say everyone that's a user with this in this category can do it. Or you can say, you can actually just here have a comma-separated array of usernames. So if you want to get that, if you want to do that. So here's the deploy to QA is exactly the same thing as production. It just unstashes it, runs the command, but it just pushes it to the different environment, and then it restashes it. And then the production, the only difference is it doesn't stash at the end, and then I have with this post section with always delete dir. So whenever a build fails or whenever it gets all the way through, we'll always delete the directories. And then I have a success notification and a failure notification. So this would be what you would put in the Jenkins file in your application project root. Normally, what I actually do, because I'm working in a microservice architecture, is I have something like this. This would go in my Jenkins file. It's just this one line, reference this global library, use it, and then the global library would be exactly the same code base as I had before, except you just wrap it in this call function here. And if you want to pass arguments in your call function for some reason, then you can define, you can have the call function accept arguments as well. But I think, any other questions? Yes.
Therefore, you're not getting a unique build in that aspect there. You're getting a build produced by this machine. May not be the same build produced by another machine.
So you could make sure, oh, okay, that's a good question. Yeah, sorry, let me repeat the question. Because I'm caching across, is it because I'm stashing across stages? Is that what you're asking about?
You're passing in your M2 cache and the volume from the
Oh, yes, yes. No, that's a good question. So this is just a thing about Maven is that this, if you look on line 13 here, there's this M2 line, the .m2. That is where all of your, like if you're a node person, when you install node libraries, it puts it somewhere on your machine. Well, if you install Maven dependencies, it puts it in that .m2 directory under a folder called repository. And we're stashing that on all these machines. And so sometimes you can get like corrupted jars in there or whatever. And, you know, what if we're making sure that we're not making sure that a particular Docker worker is always using the same one, because we can have it spread out all over the world on where our workers are. So some workarounds for that would be, you could make sure that a particular agent, you could label the agent and make sure that a particular agent is the one that always does the builds, and that way they're always using the same M2. And that's if you're using Docker. And you can do the same thing, I guess, without Docker, too. You would just make sure that a particular agent is the one that always does your builds. Also, something to mention is if you're not running a ton of builds every day, don't get crazy by making a ton of workers. Like you're creating all these resources you don't actually need. Either get a situation where workers spin up and spin down as needed, or just use the master one. Don't get nuts with needing to have, like, we need 25 build servers for like our 15 jobs a week. Like, no, you don't. Yeah, I don't know how many times I've walked into clients that have gone crazy with the number of build servers they have, and then like literally, I'm the one triggering 25% of their jobs myself, and like I don't write that much code. So that's something to be aware of. But yes, no, sorry, M2. A workaround for that would be to tie it to a particular agent. And then that way you know every build's always happening on that agent, and if something goes wrong for a particular build, if it starts happening over a group of builds, then you know there's something probably wrong in that particular M2 directory.
So why don't you, is there a good reason for that? Is it just some big time savings?
To mount it as a volume? Yeah, so if you don't mount it as a volume, so he asked if there was a reason to mount the M2 as a volume. If you don't mount it as a volume, then every time you spin up a new Docker image and run it, it's gonna have to download every one of the dependencies from the web and build it inside the Docker container. And then the Docker container gets thrown away at the end of the build. So it's gonna download every one of your dependencies every time you build. And this is like a built-in cache system. So if you say, use this particular cache that lives on this volume in the file system, most of the time it won't have to download very many dependencies whenever you run builds. Why is it in the root? That was the example that I found. I mean, yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. I would normally have it in like vars M2 something, but yeah.
That's because by default, most Docker images still run as the root user, which is not great practice.
Ah, no, that's right. That's good. So you said by default, most Docker images still run as the root user, which is not a good practice. So that's why they're probably doing that, is they're sticking it in there. Yeah, no, your groan is totally valid. Yeah, maybe that may be a reason not to use Docker images, or to use Docker images you have full control over for your builds. I think the Maven 3 Alpine is probably one of the ones that's still using root, because that's in the documentation for that particular Docker image. So I think last time I checked. So any more? Good. I think we're going to finish about 10 minutes early. So thanks to everyone for coming. I hope you all got some good benefit out of this. I tried to bring some of my war stories with me. So great. Thanks.